Some daughters bring home medical degrees, and others bring home the smell of bleach and failure, my mother announced, her voice ringing with a practiced melodic cruelty that cut through the ambient chatter of the dining room. She punctuated the statement by clinking her baccarat crystal flute against the neck of a chilled bottle of $140 Veuve Clicquot yellow label, the sharp ring of glass on glass acting like a conductor's baton for the room. 18 guests, a curated collection of the local social elite and my father's business associates, burst into a polished, synchronized laugh that felt as expensive and hollow as the surroundings. I stood there, 33 years old, my hands gripping the handles of a heavy Wedgwood porcelain gravy boat, feeling the suffocating heat of humiliation creep up my neck and burn across my cheeks. My sister Chloe, the undisputed pride of the Montgomery family with her newly minted dental practice in downtown Chicago, didn't even bother to look up from her $1,200 midnight black iPhone 15 Pro. She just smirked, her thumbs dancing over the screen as she likely shared the moment with her thousands of followers, her silence more wounding than my mother's spoken disdain. My father, Gerald Montgomery, a man who has spent 40 years valuing a clean ledger and a pristine public image over the messy reality of his own blood, didn't offer a hand or a kind word. Instead, he leaned in and whispered with a cold, clipped urgency, "Just fill the water glasses, Sierra, and for God's sake, don't make a scene." I didn't say a word. I didn't defend the fact that I had worked 16-hour shifts for the last decade, or that the smell of bleach they mocked was the scent of a woman who had built an empire from the grime they refused to touch. I just stood there and memorized the exact shade of condescension in their eyes, a specific hue of blue-blooded arrogance that I knew would look very different when the foundation of their world began to crack. My name is Sierra Montgomery. To my parents and the social circle of Greenwich, Connecticut, I am the daughter who washed out of law school and disappeared into the shameful world of service and maintenance. But in the real world, the world of blueprints, steel, and high-stakes commercial real estate, I am a high-end commercial infrastructure specialist and the CEO of Montgomery Urban Solutions. And what my family, sitting so comfortably in their $4.5 million colonial estate, has no idea about is that through a series of strategic acquisitions and silent holding companies, I now own the very floor they are walking on. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up serving gravy to people who treat me like a ghost in my own childhood home, you have to understand the hierarchy of the Montgomery household. We lived in a world of strictly enforced perfection, where every blade of grass on our 2-acre lot was trimmed to exactly 2.5 inches, and every emotion was tucked away behind a designer facade. My father ran a mid-sized logistics firm, and my mother, Diane, ran our social lives with the precision of a military general. From the time I was 7, it was made clear that Chloe was the investment and I was the surplus. Chloe was the one with the perfect teeth and the aptitude for science, the one who was destined to carry the Montgomery name into the professional stratosphere. I was the one who struggled with the rigid structures of private school, the one who found more interest in how the HVAC system in the basement worked than in the French literature we were forced to analyze. The breaking point happened 5 years ago. I was in my 2nd year of law school, a path I had chosen solely to stop the bleeding of my father's disappointment. I hated every minute of it. The dry, dusty air of the law library felt like a tomb. One Tuesday, at 2:14 in the morning, while staring at a case file on maritime law, I realized I couldn't do it anymore. I dropped out the next day. When I told my parents, sitting in the very same dining room where they now mock me, my father didn't scream. He simply looked at his watch, a vintage Patek Philippe that cost more than my tuition, and said that if I wasn't going to be a professional, I was no longer a Montgomery. He cut off my credit cards, changed the codes to the house, and told me that if I liked the dirt so much, I could go live in it. I took the $3,200 I had in my savings account and moved into a 450-square-foot studio apartment in a gritty part of Queens where the walls smelled of old grease and the radiator clanked like a dying engine every time the temperature dropped below 40 degrees. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I got a job with a commercial cleaning crew, working the graveyard shift in the massive office towers of Manhattan. While my sister was attending galas and finishing her residency, I was scrubbing the marble floors of the lobbies on Park Avenue, learning the anatomy of the buildings that make the city breathe. I realized that the people who owned the buildings didn't know the first thing about how they functioned. They didn't know about the intricate web of copper piping, the massive 500-ton centrifugal chillers in the mechanical rooms, or the fiber optic backbones that carried their billions of dollars in trades. I started small. I used my meager earnings to take night courses in mechanical engineering and property management at a local community college. I slept 4 hours a day. I wore thrift store clothes and ate 99-cent cans of tuna, saving every penny to buy my first piece of equipment, a high-pressure industrial floor restorer. Within 2 years, I had my own crew. Within 4, I was bidding on municipal contracts for subway infrastructure maintenance. I discovered I had a knack for seeing the flaws in a building's skeleton before they became catastrophes. I wasn't just a cleaner anymore. I was the person the city called when the high-rises started to fail. I formed a holding company, Some Holdings, and began buying up the debt of struggling commercial properties during the market dip. The irony of this particular dinner, this 55th birthday celebration for my father, is that he is currently celebrating a deal he thinks he made with a faceless corporation to save his logistics firm's headquarters. He thinks he's secured a 20-year lease at a subsidized rate from a benevolent landlord. He has no idea that the landlord is me. He has no idea that the very chair he is sitting in, a custom-made mahogany piece that cost $4,000, is technically situated on property that I am currently in the process of foreclosing on due to his company's hidden insolvency. The room was filled with the scent of roasted rack of lamb and expensive perfume, a cloying mix that made my lungs feel tight. I moved around the table with the practiced invisibility of a servant, a role I had assumed for the evening because my mother had called me 2 days ago, not to invite me as a guest, but to demand I help the skeleton staff she had hired because she was too cheap to pay for a full catering team. "Come and be useful, Sierra," she had said over the phone, her voice dripping with a faux pity that sounded like honey mixed with vinegar. "It'll give you a chance to see what a real career looks like. Chloe is doing so well, and it's just embarrassing to tell people you're still doing whatever it is you do with those buckets." As I leaned over to refill the glass of Mr. Henderson, a man who had helped my father hide his offshore accounts for decades, I noticed the slight tremor in my father's hand as he reached for his wine. He was putting on a good show, laughing at the right intervals, boasting about the new 2024 sapphire blue Porsche 911 Carrera he had just pre-ordered. But I could see the sweat on his upper lip. He knew the numbers weren't adding up. He knew the $1.2 million shortfall in his operating budget was a ticking time bomb. What he didn't know was that I was the one holding the detonator. I looked at Chloe, who was now showing a group of aunts a video of her new clinic. The equipment alone, the Planmeca Romexis imaging systems and the high-end dental chairs, must have cost my father $500,000 in startup loans. Loans that were collateralized against the family home, the very home I was currently standing in. I thought about the 8-year-old version of myself, the one who cried when she couldn't understand the math homework and was told by her father that she was a broken gear in a machine of excellence. I thought about the 22-year-old version of myself, standing on a rainy sidewalk in Queens with 2 trash bags of clothes, watching my father's black 2019 Cadillac Escalade drive away without a brake light flickering in hesitation. Every clink of a fork against a plate felt like a heartbeat in a story that was reaching its climax. The guests were talking about their summer plans, trips to the Amalfi Coast, and rentals in the Hamptons that cost more than a year of my employees' salaries. They were discussing the rising costs of private security and the unfortunate influx of the working class into their pristine suburbs. They didn't see the woman in the simple black uniform as a person. I was just a utility, like the electricity that powered the recessed LED lighting or the water that flowed through the gold-plated faucets in the powder room. My mother stood up again, her silk dress rustling with a sound like dry leaves. She looked at me, her eyes tracking the movement of the gravy boat, waiting for a slip, a drip, any excuse to reinforce her narrative of my incompetence. "We are so blessed," she said, her eyes sweeping the room, ignoring me entirely. "To have a family that understands the value of hard work and the rewards of a disciplined life." To Chloe, the doctor, and to Gerald, the visionary, to the Montgomery legacy. She raised her glass, and 18 people followed suit. I stood against the wall, the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains masking the expression on my face. The legacy they were toasting was a hollow shell, a beautiful porcelain vase with a hairline fracture running through its center. They didn't know that tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp, a courier would arrive at my father's office with a formal notice of lease termination and an immediate audit of the building's structural integrity. They didn't know that the daughter they mocked for the smell of bleach was the only person who could save them from the financial abyss they had ignored in favor of appearances. Family isn't about the name on the mailbox or the brand of the car in the driveway. Family is the foundation that holds you up when the storm hits, and the Montgomery Foundation was made of nothing but sand and arrogance. As I watched them drink their $140 champagne, I realized that the greatest power isn't being seen. It's being the one who controls everything while remaining completely invisible. I am Sierra Montgomery, and the floor is about to be pulled out from under them. The silence that followed my mother's toast was heavy with the suffocating weight of their collective arrogance. But my mind was already drifting back to the grueling 5-year shadow life I had led while they were busy curating their illusions of grandeur. While my sister Chloe was busy hemorrhaging $280,000 of my parents' hard-earned retirement fund to open a boutique dental clinic in the most expensive district of Scottsdale, Arizona, a place filled with rose gold accents and Italian marble that is currently $45,000 in the red due to her complete lack of business acumen, I was living as the family ghost. My existence for those 5 long, transformative years was tethered to a 550-square-foot studio apartment in a dilapidated brick building where the air always smelled faintly of damp concrete and industrial cleaning fluid. Every single night, I would lie in bed listening to the radiator, a rusted iron relic that rattled like a skeleton trying to break out of a cage, its rhythmic metallic clanging the only soundtrack to my exhaustion. I didn't have the luxury of the designer comforts they took for granted, because every solitary cent I earned from scrubbing floors and hauling debris was immediately funneled back into the hungry, demanding mouth of my fledgling company, Summit Group Services. The contrast between our lives was a jagged edge that my parents used to cut me at every possible opportunity, though they always dressed their cruelty in the guise of suburban piety. I remember the physical toll of that era vividly, the way my back would ache after 12 hours of manual labor, and the way my hands were perpetually stained with the grit of the city's underbelly. During that time, my primary mode of transportation was a battered 2012 silver ice metallic Chevrolet Malibu that had 5,000 miles on the odometer and a transmission that groaned in protest every time I shifted it into drive. The windshield had a long, spider-webbing crack that stretched from the passenger side to the center, a jagged reminder of a gravel truck on the I-95 that I simply couldn't afford to fix, because that $100 deductible was the difference between making payroll for my 2 employees or going hungry for a week. I would park that car 3 blocks away from my parents' house whenever I was summoned for a family dinner, terrified that the oil leak would leave a permanent stain on their pristine, pressure-washed cobblestone driveway and give them another reason to look at me with that signature blend of pity and disgust. At every single one of those dinners, the ritual of my humiliation was performed with the precision of a high court ceremony, usually occurring just as the dessert plates were being cleared away. My father, Robert, would reach into his alligator skin wallet, pull out a crisp $50 bill, and slide it across the table toward me with a heavy sigh that was intended to be heard by every guest in the room. He would make sure to announce that this was for gas, acting as if he were a living saint providing a lifeline to a drowning child, while in reality, he was merely purchasing the right to feel superior for another 30 days. Across the table, Chloe would be busy admiring her own reflection in the back of a spoon or bragging to our aunts about the $3,000 custom porcelain veneers she had just installed on a patient who probably didn't need them, her voice a shrill symphony of self-importance. She would look at my calloused hands, the nails cut short and the skin stained by the chemicals I used to maintain the infrastructure of the very buildings she walked through, and she would let out a small, dainty laugh that made my blood run cold. They saw a failure, a woman who couldn't cut it in the refined world of white-collar professionals, but I saw the truth that they were too blinded by their own vanity to recognize. I saw that Chloe's clinic was a sinking ship, built on a foundation of parental bailouts and vanity rather than actual medical or fiscal competence, and I saw that my parents were liquidating their future to keep her afloat. While they were handing me $50 bills like I was a charity case, I was silently acquiring the commercial paper and the underlying land leases for the strip mall where Chloe's clinic sat, moving through the shadows of the corporate world with a stealth they could never imagine. I was the one who understood the true cost of things, the way a single failed HVAC compressor could bankrupt a small business, or how a lien on a property could be leveraged into total control. The memory of those cold nights in my studio apartment, wrapped in a threadbare blanket while the wind whistled through the gaps in the window frame, is what fuels me now as I stand in this dining room holding their Wedgwood porcelain. They think they are the masters of this universe, but they are merely tenants in a house of cards that I have spent 5 years systematically dismantling and rebuilding in my own name. Every time my mother makes a snide comment about the smell of bleach on my clothes, I think about the high-grade industrial disinfectants I use to sanitize the very boardrooms where the fate of her lifestyle is being decided. Every time my father tells me to just fill the water glasses and not make a scene, I think about the legal documents sitting in my black leather briefcase out in my car, documents that prove I am no longer the daughter who needs a $50 handout for gas. I remember one specific evening, about 3 years ago, when the humidity in Connecticut was so thick you could feel it in your bones, and my Chevy Malibu finally gave up the ghost on the side of the Merritt Parkway. I sat there in the dark, the hazard lights blinking a weak rhythmic orange against the trees, and I realized that I had 2 choices. I could call my father and endure the lecture about my poor life choices while he sent a tow truck, or I could figure it out myself. I didn't call him. I sat there in the heat, the smell of burnt transmission fluid filling the cabin, and I mapped out the next 3 years of my life on the back of a crumpled invoice from a plumbing supply house. I realized then that my invisibility was my greatest asset, because they didn't believe I was capable of anything. They didn't bother to hide their financial vulnerabilities from me. They spoke openly about their debts, their tax shelters, and their declining margins, assuming I was too dull-witted to understand the implications of their words. Chloe would sit at this very table and complain about the high cost of the medical-grade air filtration systems her clinic required, never once suspecting that the company providing the maintenance for those systems, Summit Group Services, was a shell company owned by the sister she treated like a servant. She didn't know that every time she paid a service fee, she was contributing to the fund I was using to buy out the mortgage on our parents' home. It was a delicious, silent irony that sustained me through the days when my lunch was a lukewarm protein bar, and my only luxury was a quiet moment in a mechanical room where the hum of the turbines drowned out the voices of everyone who told me I was nothing. The physical environment of my parents' home now feels like a stage set, a meticulously curated display of wealth that belies the rot beneath the surface. The 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country I now drive, which I have parked discreetly 2 blocks over to maintain my cover for this one final performance, represents a reality they cannot fathom. It is a vehicle built for power and utility, much like the life I have constructed for myself out of the scrap metal and shattered expectations they left me with. I look at my mother's polished fingernails and her silk dress, and I compare them to the memory of my own hands, cracked and bleeding from the winter cold in a warehouse in Long Island City, and I feel a profound sense of clarity. The $50 bills they gave me weren't acts of kindness. They were payments for the privilege of keeping me in my place, small bribes to ensure I never looked up long enough to see the ceiling they had built over my head. But what they forgot is that I am a commercial infrastructure specialist. I don't just look at the ceiling. I look at the load-bearing walls, the foundation, and the electrical grid. I know exactly where the structural weaknesses are, and I have spent 5 years making sure I am the only one who knows how to fix them or how to let them crumble. As the dinner guests continue to laugh and the scent of the rack of lamb lingers in the air, I feel a strange sense of peace. I am the family ghost, yes, but ghosts are the ones who truly know the secrets of the house. I am the one who knows that the antique rug in the foyer is covering a soft spot in the floorboards that will cost $30,000 to repair properly. I am the one who knows that the plumbing in the guest wing is one flush away from a catastrophic backup because my father refused to pay for a professional inspection 3 years ago. I am the one who knows that the life they are celebrating tonight is an inheritance of debt and delusion. My sister can have her veneers and her failing clinic in Scottsdale. My parents can have their veuve Clicquot and their social standing. I will take the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when the lights eventually go out in this house, I am the only one who knows where the circuit breaker is located, and I am the only one with the keys to the building. The Montgomery legacy isn't something they are passing down to me. It is something I have already taken, brick by brick, and redesigned to suit a much more realistic and unforgiving ledger. The breaking point did not arrive with a scream or a grand gesture, but rather with the quiet, clinical precision of a printed document that arrived at exactly 6:42 p.m. as the secondary course was being served. The dining room was an architectural masterpiece of false warmth, illuminated by a $12,000 multi-tier Swarovski crystal chandelier that cast fractured, glittering light across the faces of 18 people who shared my DNA but none of my spirit. The air in the room was thick and cloying, a suffocating mixture of slow-roasted rosemary, sage-infused stuffing, and a pervasive, invisible layer of concentrated arrogance that seemed to settle on my skin like ash. My mother, Diane, who viewed social standing as a competitive sport, stood up with a rustle of her bespoke silk dress and began handing out what she called the annual Montgomery Family Newsletter, a high-gloss, heavy-stock card printed at a boutique shop in Greenwich that specialized in wedding invitations for the 1%. I watched as the guests took the cards with practiced interest, their fingers tracing the embossed gold foil lettering of the family name, while I remained standing near the sideboard with the heavy Wedgwood porcelain gravy boat still in my hands. When I finally received my copy, I didn't need to read the whole thing to feel the sting of the betrayal that had been carefully curated for months. Under my sister Chloe's name, the text was a celebratory laundry list of superficial triumphs, noting in bold letters her recent induction into the top 40 under 40 dentist list and the acquisition of her new 2024 selenite gray metallic Mercedes-Benz GLE 53, a vehicle my father had essentially purchased for her under the guise of a business expense. It spoke of her radiant success, her expanding practice in Scottsdale, and her bright future as the torchbearer of the Montgomery legacy. Then my eyes dropped to the single solitary line dedicated to my life, a sentence so brief and dismissive that it felt like a physical blow to the chest. Under my name, Sierra, it simply stated that I was continuing my local cleaning services and concluded with a line that was perhaps the most insulting of all. We pray for her stability. The room erupted into a low murmur of sympathetic clicks and pitying glances, the kind of sound people make when they are looking at a stray dog they have no intention of adopting. I felt the heat radiating from the $90 organic heritage turkey that sat in the center of the table, a bird that had been brined for 24 hours and roasted to a golden brown perfection that none of the people present actually deserved. I took a steadying breath, the scent of the rosemary-infused butter stinging my nostrils, and I decided to speak up, to offer a glimmer of the truth that I had been hiding behind my black service uniform. I cleared my throat, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, and mentioned that I had actually just finalized a major infrastructure contract for a 3-building commercial complex in the financial district. I wanted to tell them that the contract was valued at more than the combined annual revenue of my father's logistics firm and Chloe's failing dental practice, but I never got the chance. Chloe didn't even look up from her plate of haricots verts. She just let out a sharp, condescending laugh and interrupted me with a tone usually reserved for a slow-witted child. "Honey," she said, her voice dripping with the fake sweetness of a saccharin substitute. "Cleaning toilets isn't a contract, it's a chore." She finally looked at me then, her eyes narrowed and bright with a cruel sort of triumph, and added that I should probably go into the kitchen to check if the turkey was resting properly, because I was clearly better at manual labor than I was at high-level conversation. I looked around the table at the 18 people I had spent my entire life trying to please, waiting for a single voice of dissent, a single person to say that her comment was out of line or that my work had value. My father, Robert, was busy swirling his 2018 Opus 1 Cabernet Sauvignon in his glass, focused entirely on the legs of the wine, as if they held the secrets of the universe. My aunts and uncles suddenly found their silk napkins fascinating, and the family friends who had known me since I was a toddler simply looked away, unwilling to disrupt the carefully maintained harmony of the Montgomery social hierarchy. Not one of them defended me. In that moment, the last fraying thread of loyalty I felt toward the name Montgomery snapped with a finality that felt like a physical release. I realized that they didn't just underestimate me, they actively needed me to be the failure in their story, so that they could feel more secure in their own crumbling successes. The silence in the room was absolute for a few seconds, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer and the distant hum of the high-efficiency HVAC system I knew was overdue for a filter change. I didn't cry, and I didn't scream. Instead, I moved toward the table and set the heavy porcelain gravy boat down on the mahogany surface with such controlled, focused force that a sharp, audible crack echoed through the room. I watched a small, triangular chip of the expensive Wedgwood china fly off and land near my father's bread plate, a tiny white shard of the perfection he so desperately craved. He looked up then, his face reddening with a mixture of embarrassment and rage, his mouth opening to deliver the lecture he had been rehearsing since I dropped out of law school, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of hearing his own voice. I looked at the newsletter again, the glossy paper reflecting the harsh light of the chandelier, and I thought about the files encrypted on the $2,500 MacBook Pro sitting in my 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country, parked just 2 blocks away. I thought about the fact that Chloe's new Mercedes GLE was currently registered to a leasing company that was a subsidiary of a corporation I had acquired 3 weeks ago. I thought about the $45,000 deficit in her Scottsdale clinic that was about to be called in by the bank, a bank whose regional vice president had just finished a 3-hour dinner with me the previous Tuesday to discuss my expansion plans. The smell of the rosemary seemed to vanish, replaced by the sharp, metallic clarity of a woman who had finally stopped playing a game she was never meant to win. Every person at that table was participating in a collective delusion, a performance of wealth and stability that was being underwritten by my silence and my sweat. They viewed my black uniform as a badge of shame, never realizing it was the armor of a woman who had built a kingdom in the dark. My mother's prayer for my stability was the ultimate irony, considering I was the only thing standing between them and the structural collapse of their entire lives. I looked at Chloe's $3,000 veneers and wondered how they would look when she realized she couldn't afford the rent on the space they were housed in. I looked at my father's Patek Philippe and knew that within 48 hours, he would be checking the time to see how long he had left before the foreclosure notices became public record. As I stood there, staring at the chipped porcelain and the stunned faces of the guests, I felt a profound sense of detachment. The Montgomery house on Briarwood Lane, with its 4,000 square feet of colonial pretension and its impeccably manicured lawn, no longer felt like a home. It felt like a job site, a structure with fundamental flaws that I was no longer interested in repairing. The betrayal wasn't just in the newsletter or Chloe's insults. It was in the years of being treated as a secondary character in my own life. They wanted a ghost, a servant, a failure to balance their ledger, and for 5 years, I had played the part with a commitment that had finally paid off in ways they couldn't even begin to calculate. I didn't offer an apology for the chipped gravy boat. I didn't explain the value of a commercial infrastructure contract that involved the seismic retrofitting of a 40-story skyscraper or the management of a complex water filtration system that kept thousands of people safe. I simply turned and walked toward the kitchen, my footsteps silent on the expensive Persian rug that covered a floor I now technically owned. I could hear the hushed, urgent whispers starting up behind me, my mother's frantic attempts to smooth over the awkwardness, and my father's low, grumbling complaints about the cost of the china. They were already moving on, already rewriting the scene to make me the villain of the evening. But it didn't matter. The receipts were already printed, the signatures were already notarized, and the reality of the Montgomery family was about to catch up with the fiction they had been publishing in their gold-foiled newsletters. I walked past the $90 organic turkey, past the rows of polished copper cookware that my mother never used, and straight out the back door into the cold, crisp Connecticut air. The scent of wood smoke from the neighbors' fireplaces was a welcome relief from the rosemary and arrogance of the dining room. I walked the 2 blocks to my Tahoe, the heavy key fob in my hand a solid, comforting weight. As I climbed into the leather-trimmed interior and started the engine, the 6.2-liter V8 purred with a restrained power that felt like a mirror of my own internal state. I looked back at the glowing windows of the house, a beautiful, hollow shell filled with people who thought they were the masters of the world, and I realized that the greatest moral of this story wasn't about revenge. It was about the fact that family isn't blood. Family is the people who see your worth when you have nothing, and these people had proven, once and for all, that they were completely and utterly blind. I shifted the Tahoe into gear and drove away, leaving the Montgomery legacy to crumble behind me in the expensive, rosemary-scented dark. I walked out of that suffocating mausoleum of a house at precisely 7:15 p.m., the heavy mahogany front door clicking shut behind me with a finality that felt like a gavel striking a bench in a high-stakes courtroom. The air outside in Greenwich was a sharp, bracing contrast to the cloying, rosemary-scented heat of the dining room, the temperature already hitting a crisp 48 degrees as a biting New England wind whipped through the dormant oak trees lining Briarwood Lane. I didn't head for the sleek, powerful 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country. I had parked 2 blocks away to maintain my charade. Instead, I walked straight to the curb where my old, beat-up 2012 silver ice metallic Chevrolet Malibu sat under a flickering streetlight, looking like a discarded toy in a neighborhood of million-dollar dreams. I climbed into the driver's seat, the springs of the worn fabric chair groaning under my weight as they had for the last 5 years of my life. And I sat there in the absolute darkness of the cabin, the only light coming from the pale blue glow of the dashboard clock. The interior of the Malibu had a very specific, grounding scent, a lingering hint of old French fries from a late-night shift 3 months ago, and the faint, metallic tang of the industrial degreasers that always seemed to cling to my skin, no matter how hard I scrubbed. I sat there for several minutes, my breath hitching in the cold air, watching the silhouette of my family through the sheer silk curtains of the dining room window as they continued their celebratory dinner without a single backward glance at the empty chair I had left behind. With hands that were slightly trembling from a cocktail of adrenaline and cold, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my $1,200 midnight black iPhone 15 Pro, a device I usually kept hidden in my glove box to avoid the prying, judgmental eyes of my mother. I tapped the icon for my business banking app, the biometric sensor scanning my face in the dim light before the interface flickered to life, displaying the real-time financial heartbeat of Summit Group services. I stared at the screen for a long time, the numbers glowing with a cold, digital clarity that no gold-foiled newsletter could ever hope to replicate. Current balance, $2,412,890.42. That figure didn't include the $4.8 million in liquid assets tied up in my holding company, nor did it account for the commercial real estate deeds currently sitting in a secure vault in downtown Hartford. But seeing those 7 digits in my primary operating account felt like the ultimate vindication of every 2 a.m. shift and every insult I had swallowed like a bitter pill. I looked down at the passenger seat where the crumpled family newsletter lay discarded, the expensive, high-gloss paper reflecting the streetlights in a way that made my mother's prayers for my stability look even more pathetic than they had 10 minutes ago. In that quiet, freezing moment, a profound realization washed over me with the force of a tidal wave, stripping away the last remnants of the little girl who still craved her father's approval or her mother's pride. I realized that love in the Montgomery family was never a gift given freely or a bond earned through kindness, empathy, or shared history. It was a commodity to be traded, a status symbol bought with professional titles, prestigious degrees, and the keys to German-engineered luxury vehicles. To them, I wasn't a daughter who had shown incredible resilience and entrepreneurial spirit. I was a line item that didn't balance, a smudge on a pristine ledger that needed to be erased or pitied to maintain the integrity of their social narrative. The wind shook the Malibu, making the loose trim on the passenger door rattle with a hollow metallic sound that reminded me of the rattling radiator in my old 550-square-foot studio apartment. A sound that used to keep me awake with anxiety but now felt like a battle hymn. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs and clear the remaining fog of my sister's condescension, and I felt a strange sense of gratitude for this beat-up car and the struggle it represented. This car had carried me to the jobs that my family considered chores. It had been my mobile office when I couldn't afford a desk, and it was currently the only place in the world where the truth of Sierra Montgomery was allowed to exist. I realized that I no longer wanted or needed a seat at their table, a table that was literally and figuratively built on a foundation of debt, lies, and the exploitation of the very people they looked down upon. My father thought he was the master of his domain, sitting at the head of that mahogany table in his Patek Philippe, but he was merely a tenant in a lifestyle he could no longer afford, oblivious to the fact that the daughter he just told to check the turkey was the one who held the power to evict his entire reality. I reached out and smoothed the crumpled newsletter with my thumb, tracing the gold-embossed name of my sister Chloe and her $280,000 dental clinic in Scottsdale, which was currently hemorrhaging cash at a rate that would see it bankrupt by the end of the next fiscal quarter. I thought about how much energy they spent on appearances, on making sure the neighbors saw the right cars and the right newsletters, while I had spent my energy on the infrastructure, the bones, and the cold, hard cash that actually keeps the world turning. The irony was almost overwhelming. They prayed for my stability while their own world was teetering on the edge of a structural collapse that only I had the specialized knowledge and the capital to prevent. I wasn't just going to survive their rejection, I was going to leverage it into a total acquisition of the life they thought they owned. The quiet in the car was absolute now, a meditative space where the weight of the Montgomery name finally felt like a feather rather than a lead anchor. I thought about the $90 organic heritage turkey they were currently dissecting with silver-plated forks, and realized that their entire feast was a funeral for a legacy that had already died years ago. They just hadn't seen the body yet. I wasn't going to beg for their love or try to prove my worth through a conversation they weren't capable of having. I was going to speak to them in the only language they truly understood, the language of ownership, equity, and the finality of a signed foreclosure notice. I put the phone back in my pocket. The $2 million balance still burned into my retinas like a holy vision, and I felt a surge of predatory calm that I usually only felt when I was closing a multi-million-dollar infrastructure deal in the city. I looked at the cracked windshield, the spider-webbing lines catching the orange glow of the street lamp, and for the first time in years, I didn't see a repair I couldn't afford. I saw a relic of a woman who no longer existed, a woman who was afraid of the dark and the cold. I reached over and picked up the newsletter, folding it neatly this time, not out of respect, but because I wanted to keep it as a receipt, a physical reminder of the exact moment I stopped being a Montgomery daughter and started being the Montgomery landlord. I didn't need their validation, their $50 gas money, or their hollow prayers for my stability, because I had built a fortress of my own out of the very bleach and manual labor they mocked. As I sat there, the temperature in the car dropping further, I felt warmer than I had in years, a heat generated by the absolute certainty of my next move and the cold, calculated joy of the upcoming revelation. I looked up at the house one last time, the $4.5 million colonial estate with its perfectly trimmed hedges and its designer lighting, and I saw it for what it really was, an asset with a high overhead and a failing management team. My name is Sierra Montgomery, and while they were busy arguing over the quality of the gravy and the prestige of a dental practice in Scottsdale, I was making the final decision to buy the entire building out from under them. I put the key in the ignition, the 2012 Malibu roaring to life with a defiant, gravelly growl that echoed through the quiet, wealthy street, and I shifted into gear, leaving the Montgomery dinner party behind in my rearview mirror, a small, receding point of light in a world that was about to become very, very dark for them. The game of appearances was over, and the era of the receipts had officially begun, and as I drove toward the black Tahoe waiting for me 2 blocks away, I realized that the best part of owning the floor they walked on was the absolute power to decide exactly when to let it fall. The morning after the Thanksgiving disaster arrived with a cold, clinical clarity that matched the frost patterns forming on the windows of my 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country. I woke up at 5 a.m., not because I had a floor to scrub, but because the machinery of my retribution required a final, meticulous calibration before it could be set into motion. By 8:30 a.m., I was pulling into the parking lot of a high-end espresso bar in the heart of downtown Hartford, a place where the air was thick with the scent of roasted Arabica beans and the hushed tones of men and women who moved the world's money while the rest of the city slept. I met with my lead auditor, Marcus, a man whose mind operated like a high-velocity financial processor and who had been my most trusted strategic advisor since I secured my first municipal contract 3 years ago. We claimed a corner table made of reclaimed oak, and for the next 4 grueling hours, we meticulously pored over a mountain of legal documents, digital spreadsheets, and notarized affidavits that formed the arsenal I would use to dismantle the Montgomery myth. My family had spent years dismissing my work as a cleaning service, a term they used to categorize me as a domestic subordinate, but the reality was far more expansive and formidable. I owned Summit Group Services, a premier industrial sanitation and commercial infrastructure firm that held the exclusive maintenance and sanitation contracts for 85% of the luxury resorts and high-capacity commercial spaces across the Southwest and Northeast corridors. While my mother was busy praying for my stability, I was overseeing a workforce of 240 employees and managing an annual operating budget that dwarfed my father's struggling logistics firm by a factor of 10. Marcus slid a heavy cerulean blue folder across the table toward me, and I pulled out the specific master service agreement for the Biltmore Grand Resort, the crown jewel of the regional hospitality industry, and more importantly, the exact venue where my parents were planning to host their 40th Anniversary Gala in just 3 weeks. I looked at the final page of the contract, tracing the line where my name, Sierra Montgomery, was printed in bold as the CEO of the primary vendor, a position that gave me total control over the operational status of the venue's ballrooms, kitchens, and sanitation systems. My parents had already paid a non-refundable $60,000 deposit to the resort, money they had likely scraped together from my father's dwindling capital reserves, and they had no idea that I was the one who could effectively shutter the entire event with a single administrative order. It was a staggering realization, a moment of pure, unadulterated leverage that felt more substantial than any of the $50 bills my father had ever slid across a dinner table. But the Biltmore contract was only the first piece of the puzzle I was assembling to correct the balance of the last 5 years. Next, we turned our attention to the financial disaster that was my sister Chloe's dental practice in Scottsdale, a boutique clinic that she treated like a high-fashion accessory rather than a business. Marcus opened a secondary file containing the tax liens I had quietly acquired through a nested series of holding companies designed to remain invisible to the casual observer. Chloe had been so focused on the aesthetic of her clinic, the $1,200 iPhone 15 Pro, the designer dental chairs, and the 2024 Mercedes-Benz GLE 53, that she had neglected the fundamental obligations of a business owner. She had failed to pay her state payroll taxes for 3 consecutive quarters, and she was currently in default on a massive equipment loan that my parents had co-signed with their personal residence as collateral. I had bought those liens for 70 cents on the dollar, effectively becoming my sister's primary creditor and the silent holder of the mortgage on my parents' home. The weight of this information was immense, a physical presence in the room that seemed to make the air vibrate with the potential for total transformation. I spent the next hour cross-referencing the dates of my father's recent business failures with the acquisition timeline of my own properties, confirming that I now held the master lease on his corporate headquarters through my primary real estate arm, Sum Holdings. He thought he was negotiating a lease extension with a faceless institutional landlord, but in reality, he was begging for mercy from the daughter he had told to just fill the water glasses and not make a scene. I felt a cold, predatory satisfaction as I realized that the Montgomery legacy was no longer in my father's hands. It was sitting in a series of manila folders on an espresso bar table, waiting for me to decide its final value. Marcus watched me as I organized the documents, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp with the professional respect of a man who knew he was watching a master at work. He asked if I was ready to pull the trigger on the foreclosure notices, and for a moment, I thought about the smell of the rosemary in the dining room and the way the guests had laughed when my mother insulted me. I thought about the 2012 Chevy Malibu with the cracked windshield and the 5 years I spent as a ghost in my own life while they lived a lie at my expense. I told him to hold the notices for exactly 14 days, wanting the proximity to their precious Anniversary Gala to be the catalyst that finally forced them to look at the receipts of their own arrogance. I began the careful process of packing the arsenal into a black leather Toomey briefcase, a $1,500 piece of professional equipment that was as durable as it was understated. I tucked the Biltmore contract into the front pocket, followed by the tax liens against Chloe's clinic and the lease termination notice for my father's office. Each document was a brick I had reclaimed from the wall they had built around me, a piece of structural evidence that proved my worth was never something they had the power to define. The leather of the briefcase was cool and supple under my fingers, a tactile reminder of the distance I had traveled from the days of carrying my belongings in trash bags after my father changed the locks on the family home. As I stood up to leave, the espresso bar was bustling with the mid-morning rush, a sea of people in tailored suits and expensive coats who would never suspect that the woman in the simple dark sweater was currently holding the financial execution orders for one of the town's most prominent families. I thanked Marcus and walked out into the bright, freezing sunlight, the Toomey briefcase hanging heavy at my side like a loaded weapon. I walked past a parked 2024 Porsche 911, the same model my father had boasted about pre-ordering, and I didn't feel a flicker of envy. I felt the calm, detached power of someone who could buy and sell the dealership without breaking a sweat. The strategy was now fully operational, and the pieces were moving across the board with a momentum that could not be reversed. My parents and my sister were still living in the world of the newsletter, a world where Sierra was the cleaning girl who needed prayers for stability, and Chloe was the top 40 under 40 success story. They were walking on a floor that was technically mine, breathing air in a building I controlled, and planning a celebration in a resort where I was the primary vendor. They had spent decades valuing the appearance of success over the reality of it, and they were about to learn that in the high-stakes world of commercial infrastructure and industrial sanitation, appearances don't pay the bills, receipts do. I climbed into the Tahoe, the 6.2-liter engine turning over with a deep, guttural hum that signaled the beginning of the end for the Montgomery facade. I placed the Toomey briefcase on the passenger seat, right where the crumpled newsletter had sat the night before, and I felt a sense of alignment that I hadn't known since I was a child. I wasn't just a daughter seeking revenge. I was a specialist conducting a necessary demolition of a structurally unsound legacy. The Montgomerys wanted a scene, and I was going to give them one that would be recorded in the public record for years to come. As I pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward my regional office, I realized that the best part of the truth isn't just that it sets you free. It's that it gives you the power to rebuild everything from the ground up, exactly the way you want it to be. The countdown to the 40th Anniversary Gala had officially begun, and I was the only one who knew that the guest of honor was actually the one who owned the room. The evening of the 40th Anniversary Gala arrived with the kind of oppressive, humid heat that only a Connecticut summer can produce. Though inside the grand ballroom of the Biltmore Grand Resort, the air was chilled to a precise 68 degrees by a massive industrial HVAC system that I had personally inspected 3 weeks prior. The venue was a cathedral of manufactured prestige, a space dripping in $25,000 worth of imported white orchids that cascaded from the gilded balconies like frozen waterfalls, their cloying, sweet scent battling the expensive perfumes of the 150 guests who occupied the circular tables below. My parents, Robert and Diane Montgomery, were already positioned on the elevated stage at the front of the room, standing beneath a localized spotlight that cost $400 an hour to operate. Basking in the performative adoration of a social circle they had spent 4 decades and most of their liquid capital trying to impress. They looked like royalty from a distance, my mother in a floor-length gown of shimmering navy sequins, and my father in a custom-engineered tuxedo that hid the fact that he had been losing weight from the sheer stress of his impending financial collapse. I arrived exactly 45 minutes after the first course had been served, timed to ensure that the room was at its peak atmospheric density and that my entry would be impossible to ignore. I wasn't the invisible girl in the stained black apron anymore, the one who smelled of bleach and failure. I was a silhouette of sharp, unapologetic power, wearing a $4,500 charcoal Saint Laurent suit that had been tailored to fit like a second skin, the fabric absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. I had paired it with a set of black pointed-toe heels that clicked against the polished marble floor, with the rhythmic, predatory, steady beat of a clock counting down to 0. No one recognized me at first because the woman walking through those double mahogany doors looked like she owned the entire zip code, not just the service contract for the building. I watched as heads turned and conversations faltered in my wake, the local elite squinting through the dim light of the crystal chandeliers to identify the stranger who carried herself with more authority than the guests of honor. I moved through the room with a calculated, leisurely pace, my eyes scanning the faces of the aunts, uncles, and family friends who had participated in the ritual of my dismissal just weeks prior at the Thanksgiving table. I saw Mr. Henderson, the man who helped my father hide his losses, and I saw the cousins who had whispered about my lack of a degree, all of them now looking at me with a mixture of confusion and sudden, unearned respect, based purely on the cut of my jacket. When I finally reached the foot of the stage, my mother caught sight of me, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before her face hardened into that familiar mask of maternal disappointment that had been the backdrop of my entire life. She leaned over the edge of the stage as the master of ceremonies was finishing a glowing introduction, her voice a sharp, venomous hiss that barely carried over the ambient noise of the room, but landed with the precision of a scalpel. "Sierra," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously to the guests sitting in the front row, "you are underdressed. You are incredibly late, and you are making a scene just by standing there." She didn't notice the Toomey briefcase I was carrying, nor did she notice the way the resort staff, my staff, snapped to attention as I passed them. She only saw the daughter she had decided was a failure. She gestured toward the very back of the ballroom, where the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains obscured the tables reserved for the distant cousins and the people my parents considered secondary to the Montgomery narrative. "Go sit in the back row," she commanded, her hand trembling slightly as she adjusted the $20,000 diamond necklace that was currently leveraged against a house she no longer technically owned. I stood my ground, the charcoal fabric of my suit feeling like armor, and I looked her directly in the eye with a level of calm that clearly terrified her. I didn't move toward the back. Instead, I took a step closer to the stage, the light from the overhead spot catching the sharp lines of my jaw and the cold, unblinking clarity of my expression. I could see my father behind her, his face pale and clammy, his hands clutching a champagne flute as if it were the only thing keeping him upright in a world that was rapidly losing its structural integrity. The room was filled with the sound of 150 people breathing, laughing, and clinking silverware against fine bone china, a symphony of excess that was being played on a stage I had built with my own hands. My mother's demand that I hide in the back row was the final pathetic gasp of a dying regime, a desperate attempt to maintain the hierarchy that had kept me in the shadows for 5 years. She still believed she was the one in control, still believed that the smell of bleach was the only thing I brought to the table, and still believed that a seat in the back was where I belonged. She had no idea that the charcoal Saint Laurent suit was just the beginning of the transformation, or that the Toomey briefcase contained the legal documents that would turn this gala into a foreclosure hearing before the final toast was even poured. I looked at Chloe, who was sitting at the primary family table wearing a dress that likely cost more than my first industrial floor buffer. Her $1,200 iPhone 15 Pro held aloft as she recorded our mother's triumphant moment. She looked at me with a brief flicker of recognition that quickly turned into a sneer, her lips curling over those $3,000 veneers as she whispered something to the man sitting next to her. They all thought they were watching a social faux pas, a daughter who didn't know her place, when in reality they were watching the literal owner of the room take her position at the center of the board. The white orchids, the crystal flutes, the $140 bottles of Veuve Clicquot. It was all an elaborate set piece, and I was the only person in the room who knew that the lease on the theater had expired. As my mother turned back to the audience, prepared to give her speech about the endurance of the Montgomery legacy and the importance of family values, I felt the physical weight of the Toomey briefcase in my hand, a solid and comforting reminder of the 4 hours I had spent with Marcus and the millions of dollars currently sitting in my operating account. I didn't feel anger, and I didn't feel the need to scream. I felt the absolute icy detachment of a commercial infrastructure specialist who had identified a catastrophic failure in the load-bearing walls of a building and was simply waiting for the inevitable collapse. My mother wanted me in the back row because she was afraid that my presence would remind people of the truth she had spent decades trying to sanitize. She wanted me to be the ghost again, the silent servant who filled the water glasses and didn't make a scene. But that version of Sierra Montgomery had died on the side of the Merritt Parkway 3 years ago. The master of ceremonies stepped back, and the room went silent as my father took the microphone, his voice amplified by a sound system that my company had calibrated just 2 days ago. He started to speak about the last 40 years, about the struggles and the triumphs, and about the pride he felt in his children, specifically highlighting Chloe's dental practice as a beacon of the family's continued excellence. I stood there, a few feet from the stage, listening to the lies pour out of the speakers, and I realized that the Montgomerys didn't just value appearances, they were addicted to them, even when the reality beneath their feet was nothing but rot and debt. My mother's hiss was still echoing in my ears, a reminder of the exact shade of condescension that had fueled my rise through the ranks of the city's infrastructure. I didn't head for the back row, and I didn't leave. I simply stood at the edge of the spotlight, a dark, sharp-edged reminder of everything they had tried to erase. The guests were starting to notice that I wasn't moving, the whispers rippling through the front tables like a wind through tall grass. My mother kept glancing at me, her eyes wide with a growing panic as she realized that her authority over me had vanished somewhere between the Thanksgiving table and the Biltmore Grand. She had told me I was underdressed, but the truth was that I was the only person in the room wearing the reality of the situation. I was the one who had gathered the arsenal, the one who had bought the tax liens, and the one who had signed the master service agreement that allowed this party to even exist. The white orchids seemed to wilt slightly under the intensity of the moment, their petals bruised by the weight of the silence I was imposing on the room just by existing in that Saint Laurent suit. I looked at the Toomey briefcase and then back at my parents, who were now clinging to each other on the stage, a picture-perfect couple standing on a foundation of shifting sand. The gala was supposed to be their crowning achievement, a testament to 40 years of Montgomery superiority, but it was about to become the site of their most public and permanent demolition. My name is Sierra Montgomery, and I wasn't there to sit in the back row or to listen to a distant cousin's complaints about the cold appetizers. I was there to present the receipts and to show them exactly what happens when you treat the person who owns the floor like she's just there to clean it. The spotlight was about to shift, and for the first time in 40 years, the Montgomerys were going to see exactly what was standing in the shadows, waiting for the music to stop. The atmosphere in the Biltmore Grand Ballroom shifted with the violent suddenness of a structural failure as the resort manager, Mr. Sterling, a man whose approval my father had been soliciting with desperate, sweaty palm shakes all evening, stepped toward the gold-plated microphone. My parents were still standing in the center of the stage, their faces frozen in a practiced tableau of marital bliss, unaware that the air they were breathing was about to be sucked out of the room. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, his voice projecting through the high-fidelity sound system with a resonant authority that commanded the attention of every last one of the 150 guests. We would like to take a moment to thank our primary infrastructure and operations partner, whose vision and maintenance standards made this evening's event possible, he announced, his eyes scanning the crowd and landing directly on me with a level of professional deference that made my mother's previous hissed insults seem like a distant, fading echo. I didn't hesitate. I stepped out of the shadows and walked onto the stage, the heels of my black shoes striking the wood with the rhythmic, deliberate weight of a funeral march. And as I ascended the 3 steps to join my family, the silence that fell over the room was so absolute and deafening that you could hear the faint hum of the $20,000 kitchen equipment in the distance. I reached out and took the microphone from Mr. Sterling's hand, my fingers brushing the cool metal as I turned to look directly at my father, whose face had transitioned from a pale, pasty white to a sickly, mottled gray. Behind him, my mother was clutching her crystal flute so tightly I expected the baccarat glass to shatter against her diamond rings, her eyes wide with a dawning, panicked realization that the girl she had ordered to sit in the back row was no longer following her script. "Dad, Mom," I began, my voice amplified and steady, carrying through the ballroom with the cold, unyielding precision of an industrial laser. "For years you have stood in rooms exactly like this one and told everyone who would listen that I was the daughter who just cleaned houses, the one who brought home the smell of bleach and failure while you prayed for my stability." I let the words hang in the air for a deliberate 3 seconds, watching as the guests at the front tables, the elite of Greenwich and the investors my father had been lying to for months, began to lean in with a morbid, electric curiosity. I adjusted the Toomey briefcase at my side and continued, my gaze never wavering from my father's trembling chin as I delivered the first of the cold, hard receipts. "Since I am apparently so gifted at cleaning, I thought I should use my professional expertise to tidy up your current financial situation," I said, the irony cutting through the scent of the white orchids like a sharp winter wind. As the founder and CEO of Summit Group Services, the multi-state commercial infrastructure firm that holds the $1.2 million annual service and sanitation contract for this entire resort, I have decided to take a personal interest in your 40-year milestone. I watched the resort manager nod in confirmation, a gesture that acted as a silent executioner's blade for my parents' social standing, and I continued the delivery. "Because I know how much you value a clean ledger, Dad, I've decided to personally comp your entire bill for this gala tonight, all $38,400 of it, as a gift from the daughter who you claimed had no future." The gasps from the audience were audible now, a collective intake of breath that signaled the total collapse of the Montgomery facade, as the reality that their servant daughter was actually the resort's most powerful vendor settled into the room like heavy sediment. But I wasn't finished with the demolition of their manufactured world, and I turned my body slightly to face my sister Chloe, who was standing at the edge of the stage with her $1,200 iPhone 15 Pro still held in a shaking hand, her mouth agape in a way that would have been embarrassing for a dentist. "And Chloe," I said, my voice dropping an octave to a tone of pure, clinical finality, "since we are being honest about professional achievements, let's talk about the prestigious dental clinic in Scottsdale that the family newsletter was so proud of." I saw her flinch as if I had reached out and physically struck her across her $3,000 veneers. "Since your boutique practice is currently 90 days past due on its commercial lease, a lease that my holding company, Sum Holdings, quietly acquired from your original creditors 3 weeks ago, we won't be needing any more prayers for my stability." I watched the color drain from her face as she realized that the rose gold accents and Italian marble of her failing clinic were now part of my portfolio. "I'll see you at my regional office at precisely 0900 hours this Monday morning to discuss your formal eviction and the liquidation of the equipment my parents used their home to collateralize." The room remained trapped in that suffocating, motionless silence, the 150 guests now staring at my parents and sister as if they were car crash victims on the side of a highway, stripped of their designer dignity and exposed for the debtors they truly were. No more lies, no more newsletters, and no more $50 gas money handouts to the daughter who was apparently the only one at this table with a positive net worth, I stated, the microphone picking up the sharp, final click of my Toomey briefcase as I latched it shut. "It's just the math now, and the math says that the Montgomery legacy is currently insolvent and under new management. I handed the microphone back to Mr. Sterling, who took it with a respectful bow of his head, and I turned my back on the stage, walking away from the spotlights and the white orchids without looking back to see the tears that were starting to track through my mother's expensive foundation. As I walked back through the center aisle, the guests parted like the Red Sea, their faces a blur of shock and newfound terror as they realized that the woman in the $4,500 Saint Laurent suit was the person who held the contracts to their office buildings, their resorts, and their country clubs. I could hear my father trying to stammer an explanation, his voice cracking and small without the amplification of the speakers. But it was over. The scene he had feared I would make had finally happened, and it was a masterpiece of structural demolition. I walked through the double mahogany doors and out into the cooling Connecticut night, the scent of the wood smoke and the salt from the distant sound finally replacing the cloying, artificial smell of the gala. I didn't head for the old Chevy Malibu this time. I walked straight to the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country, its LED signature lights flashing a welcome as I approached. I climbed into the driver's seat, the smell of the high-grade leather and the silence of the cabin providing a sanctuary that I had earned through 5 years of invisible, grinding labor. I sat there for a moment, my hands on the steering wheel, watching the valet drivers scurrying around to retrieve cars for the guests who were already beginning to flee the Biltmore Grand in a desperate attempt to distance themselves from the Montgomery scandal. The 40th Anniversary Gala was supposed to be the crowning achievement of their lives, the moment where they cemented their place at the top of the social hierarchy. But instead, it had become the site of their public execution by facts. Family isn't a brand you build on a foundation of lies and the backs of the people you consider beneath you. Family is the integrity you show when the lights are off and the receipts are due. I looked at the digital clock on the Tahoe's dashboard, which read 9:42 p.m., and I felt a sense of peace that was deeper and more profound than any revenge could ever provide. I had spent my entire life trying to be the daughter they wanted, and when I finally stopped, I became the woman who owned the world they were so afraid of losing. I shifted the Tahoe into drive, the powerful engine humming with a restrained, rhythmic energy as I pulled out of the resort's circular driveway and headed toward the highway. I knew that Monday morning would be difficult, and I knew that the process of liquidating the life they had built would be a long and tedious chore. But as a commercial infrastructure specialist, I was used to the heavy lifting. My name is Sierra Montgomery, and while I may have started with the smell of bleach and failure, I ended the night with the only thing that actually matters in a world of appearances: the truth, the title, and every single one of the receipts. I drove into the dark, the lights of the city flickering in the distance like a new set of blueprints, ready to build something real on the ground I had finally reclaimed. The look on my mother's face in that final, frozen moment on the stage of the Biltmore Grand was worth every 80-hour work week, every chemical burn I had ever sustained from industrial-grade cleaners, and every lonely night I had spent in that rattling studio apartment in Queens. The meticulously curated family newsletter, that gold-foiled instrument of my public shaming and Chloe's unearned glorification, was effectively dead, buried under the weight of the $38,400 debt I had just publicly erased and the eviction notice I had just as publicly served. The silence that followed my departure from the ballroom was the loudest thing I had ever heard, a vacuum created by the sudden collapse of a 40-year-old lie that had finally run out of oxygen. By the next morning, the atmospheric pressure of our family dynamic had completely inverted, as evidenced by the 14 missed calls from my parents that illuminated the screen of my phone before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. Suddenly, the father who told me to just fill the water glasses, and the mother who prayed for my stability were intensely, almost frantically, interested in my business insights and my perspective on the family's structural integrity. I didn't answer a single one of those calls, nor did I listen to the voicemails that I knew would be a desperate cocktail of forced apologies, gaslighting, and thinly veiled pleas for financial salvation. Instead, I sat in the sun-drenched living room of my new 4,000-square-foot penthouse overlooking the Hartford skyline, a space designed with minimalist precision and floored with the very same reclaimed oak I had admired in the espresso bar where Marcus and I finalized the arsenal. I picked up my phone one last time to execute a final clinical severance, blocking their numbers with a series of taps that felt like the closing of a heavy vault door. I then sent a single formal email via my lead legal counsel at Summit Group Services, a document that was as cold and unyielding as the infrastructure I managed. The email stated in no uncertain terms that any future communication regarding loans, lease negotiations, or family gatherings would be filtered through my executive assistant and legal team, effectively removing the Montgomerys from the personal ledger of my life. I spent that Sunday morning in a state of profound, quiet catharsis, watching the light catch the edges of a hand-blown crystal glass as I sipped a simple glass of chilled water. That glass alone cost more than the total trade-in value of Chloe's first car, a detail that I didn't acknowledge with arrogance, but with a deep sense of settled justice. The penthouse was silent, a stark contrast to the clattering radiator of my past and the clinking champagne flutes of the gala. And in that silence, I finally felt the weight of the word disgrace lift off my shoulders and vanish into the clear Connecticut air. I wasn't the failure who dropped out of law school, the daughter who smelled of bleach, or the burden that needed to be explained away to the neighbors. I was the owner, the landlord, and the architect of a reality that none of them possessed the vision to understand. I looked out at the city below, at the office towers and the commercial complexes whose skeletons I knew better than my own family's history, and I realized that my worth had never been something they had the authority to calculate. They had spent decades judging me by the grime on my hands while ignoring the fact that I was the one keeping their world from falling apart. Chloe's prestigious dental practice in Scottsdale was now nothing more than a line item in my liquidation strategy, a physical manifestation of her greed and our parents' blind favoritism that I would dismantle with the same professional detachment I used for a faulty boiler system. My parents' home, the colonial estate on Briarwood Lane that had been the stage for so many of my humiliations, was now an asset on my balance sheet, a piece of real estate that I would eventually sell to the highest bidder without a single flicker of sentimentality. The physical environment of my penthouse reflected the person I had become, a woman who valued the integrity of the foundation over the polish of the facade. There were no white orchids here, no gold-foiled newsletters, and no synchronized laughter from people who only loved you when you were winning. There was only the hum of the high-end climate control system, the soft texture of the Italian leather sofa, and the absolute, unshakable certainty of the math. I thought about the 2012 Chevy Malibu, which I had finally sold for scrap the day before, and I felt a sense of gratitude for the lessons it had taught me about endurance and the power of being invisible. That car had seen the worst of my struggle, and it had carried me to the threshold of a victory that my family would never be able to replicate because they lacked the one thing I had in abundance, the willingness to do the work that no one else wanted to do. The transition from daughter to landlord was not a move of revenge, though the Montgomerys would certainly paint it as such to anyone who would still listen to them. It was a move of structural necessity. A building cannot stand on a rotten foundation, and a family cannot survive when its primary currency is condescension and lies. By taking control of their debt and their assets, I wasn't just punishing them. I was performing a long overdue foreclosure on a lifestyle that had been insolvent for a generation. I watched a hawk circle one of the nearby skyscrapers, its movements graceful and predatory, and I felt a kinship with its singular focus. I had spent 5 years in the dark, learning the geography of power, and now that I was standing in the light, I had no intention of ever letting anyone else hold the deed to my dignity again. My assistant called me at noon to confirm that the eviction notices for Chloe's clinic had been successfully delivered and that my father's office manager had already reached out to schedule a meeting to discuss the new lease terms. I told her to make them wait, to let the reality of their situation settle into their bones for a few more days before we offered them any path forward. I wanted them to feel the exact weight of the instability they had prayed I would overcome, to understand what it's like when the floor you've walked on your whole life suddenly belongs to someone you treated like a ghost. It was a lesson in physics as much as it was in finance. For every action of cruelty, there is an equal and opposite reaction of consequence. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across my living room, I realized that the greatest moral of the Montgomery story wasn't about the money or the penthouse or the Saint Laurent suit. It was about the fact that family isn't blood. Family is the people who see your value when you're covered in the grit of the real world, and the people who don't deserve a seat at your table shouldn't be the ones deciding what you're worth. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, my reflection ghosting against the glass, and I saw a woman who was finally, completely herself. The bleach smell was gone, replaced by the scent of success and the metallic tang of absolute control. I poured myself another glass of water, the crystal cool against my palm, and I made a silent toast to the girl in the 2012 Malibu and the woman who had just comped a $38,000 bill to prove a point. The Montgomery legacy was officially under new management, and for the first time in 33 years, the books were finally balanced. I wasn't a disgrace, and I wasn't a chore. I was the person who owned the very ground they stood on, and I was finally ready to start building something that was actually built to last. The aftershocks of the gala would continue for months, and the legal battles would be tedious. But as I looked out at the city I helped maintain, I knew that I had already won the only war that mattered. I had reclaimed my name, my future, and my floor, and I had done it all while they were too busy looking down to see me rising. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as I looked around my empty, beautiful penthouse, I realized that the only person who had ever truly stayed for me was me. And that was more than enough.